So, Congressman Dan Crenshaw recently went on Joe Rogan's podcast, and they had a bit of a back and forth about Medicare for all and kind of what classifies as socialism. Recently, Joe Rogan kind of came under fire about some comments he made about Joe Biden. That isn't the focal point of this clip, but I do encourage all of you to go and watch the full podcast with Joe Rogan because he does clarify the comments that he made. But in this little back and forth, they kind of discuss what exactly qualifies as socialism. And so Joe Rogan, I actually think, does a really good job of holding Dan Crenshaw's feet to the fire. So let's take a look at the clip.
Well, it doesn't work with everything, but it doesn't that work with the fire department? Isn't the fire department in a lot of ways a socialist institution?
No. Again, I still say it is not, because it is not under any obligation to serve everybody that demands its service, right? It's there for specific emergency service.
So that, I mean, just right off the bat, yes, it does. The fire department does not discriminate on who they go and put out fires for. If you have a fire and you call the fire department, they will come and they will put out your fire. So just right there, right on his face, wrong about that. But let's keep going.
As a public good.
But it's there for fire. If there's a fire, they come in and help you. There's not a financial incentive for them to do so.
Right, but I mean, but on a practical level, though, imagine the scaling that has to occur if you're doing that with medical care. And I
So now he just turned, he knew that his first argument didn't really make sense. So now he's talking about, well, we're talking about a much bigger picture because, the fire department, they cover a small thing and we would have to scale outward. And so basically now he's saying that, like, oh, it would be too big. It's not like the actual tenets of the program that are bad. It's that it would just be too big to be unfeasible. And so let's keep going.
And I think that's the difference both from an economic point and a practical standpoint.
Right, so, but we're talking about you're talking about socialism overall, not just just involving medicine. You're talking about socialism in general, and I'm saying, isn't the fire department an example of socialism that works?
Well, it's definitely not an example of socialism. I think it's an example of a public good, the way the military is an example of a public good, the way the highways are examples of public goods, the way parks are examples of public goods. Right, but
they're funded by...
So this is a super common, distinction that I feel like conservatives really like to make because they don't want to classify things like the fire department, things like education. They don't want to classify them as socialist kind of programs, so they have this separate definition of making it's a public good. But if we had Medicare for all, then healthcare wouldn't be a public good. It would be socialism, but the fire department isn't socialism, it's a public good. So it's just this completely arbitrary distinction that they make that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And Joe Rogan pushes back on it, so let's take a look.
People. It's funded by people overall, and it doesn't cost people money to use them, and the people have these as a basic part of our society and our civilization.
No, I understand that, and I have no problem with that. I just would not call them socialists.
Well, what would you call the fire department? How does it get funded?
It's a public good.
How does it get funded?
It's a public good. It's funded by the public,
right?
And it's not relying on it's not relying on the tenets of socialism to function.
What are the tenets of socialism if not run by the government? What is the tenets of socialism if not being run by the government? Because the fire department is run by the government. The government sets the wages of the people that work there. They completely fund it. It is free at the point of service for taxpayers. It is by definition adhering to the tenets of socialism. But he has just arbitrarily decided that, well, of course it's not socialism because I agree with this thing. I think that we should have fire departments, so of course it's not socialism. Because of course he's not going to say, because in his, theoretically, if he is being really strict with his worldview, he does not think that there should be a fire department because he thinks that it would be more efficient for us to just have, private fire departments that you hire and you would, pay for, a certain fire department and they cover you, and, poor people just wouldn't have necessarily be able to at least get good fire departments to come to their house like that. Theoretically, if he is going really strict with what he believes makes things effective, he does not think that having the fire department is a good idea. He would think that having private, separate fire departments that don't necessarily cover everybody, he would think that that is a more efficient way to do things. Obviously, he's not going to say that because he knows that that's silly. And so he decided to make this separate distinction that fire departments are actually public goods, but healthcare, Medicare for all would not be a public good. So there's a little bit more.
And now we're kind of having a discussion of definitions, and,
right.
and this is an important discussion to have, because oftentimes even Democrats aren't really talking about socialism.
Well, even Bernie Sanders doesn't call it socialism. He's talking about democratic socialism, and he makes some very clear distinctions between the two of them, which I think you could apply to things like the fire department or the police department.
Yeah, there's a lot in that. So I think Bernie, yes, he does say democratic socialism. I think he does mean something much closer to socialism, and that's just me gleaning from his policies.
So this is really important here, because people love to call Bernie Sanders just a full socialist, and like, I mean, he's talking about definitions here and how people don't understand definitions. I don't think that Dan Crenshaw fully understands what a full socialist means. Bernie Sanders does not believe in total seizure of the means of production by the government, that the government should run everything, because that is what socialism is. Pure socialism is that the government runs everything. The government, they make your laptops, they make cars, they make literally everything. They fund everything. It's all funded through taxpayers. It's totally government. There is no free market. There's no private entities whatsoever. That is not what Bernie Sanders is calling for whatsoever. He does support democratic socialism. Obviously, there's a debate whether or not it's democratic socialism. That's not important. But what he's actually arguing for is that certain things should not be in the private sector. Things such as healthcare, education, prisons. These are things that there should be no profit motive tied to these things, because it's incredibly problematic to have profit motives tied to these things. And so that is what democratic socialism is arguing, is taking certain things out of the market. Like these certain things, they should not be handled by the free market, because there are things that happen where things like healthcare, it shouldn't matter if you're poor or if you're rich, if you can have access to healthcare. That shouldn't be dependent on what you can get. Maybe the size of like the laptop that you can buy. Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. That's not, because you don't need that to survive. You don't need a really nice laptop to survive. So the government doesn't need to be in charge of making laptops. They don't need to be in charge of making cars. But healthcare, people, if you get cancer, if you can't afford treatment, you need healthcare if you want to survive. So that should be taken out of the marketplace. That should not be determined by the size of your wallet. So that is incredibly important. So let's keep looking.
Because he does talk about putting government control on corporate boards. Elizabeth Warren talked about the same things. Now, we really are talking about nationalizing things. When you're talking about mass price controls across all industries and wage controls, you really are talking about...
Bernie Sanders has never once argued for mass price controls across all industries, across like nationalizing all industries. Never once.
Of an actual socialism. Again, going back to whether a fire department or a park or a public highway or the military is a socialist institution, again, I would really push back against that. That is a public good. We've never, in our culture, in our economics, we've never defined these things as socialist institutions. A socialist institution effectively means you're seizing the means of production, and you're forcing everybody into a centralized planning state. You're telling people what they will earn and what you will pay them, how much they can sell. You start to take more control over the economy. A lot of the policies set out by Bernie Sanders are movements in that direction. The fire department is really not. That is a public service. It has a defined budget. It has a defined role.
So his audio got a little bit shaky there, because it's on Skype. But he says it has a defined budget and it has a defined role. Who defines that budget, Dan? Who defines that budget? The government. The government defines that budget. Who defines that role? The government. The government does that. Literally, the definition that he just put towards socialism is what he is saying the fire department is. He just says, because they have a defined budget. Who defines the budget? Who? The government. The government defines it. There's a little bit more. Let's just play it.
It doesn't meet any of those other attributes or elements that I describe when I describe what a socialist is.
So there you have it. I mean, I really, Joe Rogan, he gets a lot of hate. I think that he did a lot better than, frankly, many of the people who ran for the Democratic primary, like people in the primaries. I don't think that Pete Buttigieg would be able to push back on something like that, or Amy Klobuchar, or definitely not Joe Biden. So I think that Mike Bloomberg. Could you imagine Mike Bloomberg making these arguments? Never. Joe Rogan did a really good job pushing back on what is this different, because and I really don't even think that Joe Rogan was trying to push back necessarily. He was just like, he didn't understand it, because what Dan Crenshaw was saying just didn't make any sense on its face. And so I think that I'm glad though that he kept pushing back on it, and I really do think that a lot of the hate that gets levied at Joe Rogan is pretty unjustified. But there you have it. There's Dan Crenshaw making a case for why, for whatever reason, healthcare couldn't be a public good. It's really such a silly argument. But anyway, if you guys disagreed with anything I said in this video, make sure to leave a comment down below. But if you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe, and have a great day.